Everyone, do you all know what a Maison Close is? Maison Close existed in 19th century France. The name may sound like a fancy apartment building, but in fact, it refers to a 19th century Parisian brothel. During this time, many of these establishments were built with enormous budgets, creating spaces decorated with stunning beauties and luxurious interiors. One of the defining features of the Maison Close was its secrecy, meaning that these brothels operated discreetly, without attracting attention, and the buildings were deliberately designed so that people couldn't see inside. Surprisingly, these brothels were government-approved institutions. So, what exactly was the mysterious Maison Close? What kind of women worked there? And what happened inside these closed doors? Let's step into the world behind those shut doors and take a glimpse inside. Background to the creation of Maison Close. One major issue affecting Paris at the time was a particular disease. That disease was syphilis, which spread through sexual contact. Syphilis would begin with skin symptoms like sores or rashes, but if it reached the brain or spinal cord, it could cause memory loss, movement disorders, and ultimately lead to death. At the time, there were no established methods for diagnosing or treating syphilis. Once it became known that the disease could be passed from mother to child during childbirth, it was argued that syphilis was causing a decline in birth rates and was responsible for a weakening population. Additionally, after France lost the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, some attributed the defeat to the widespread syphilis infection, which allegedly weakened the military forces. In other words, syphilis was seen as a national threat, spreading fear across France. With a widespread recognition that the disease needed to be eradicated. To combat the spread of syphilis, the French government devised a plan to regulate prostitution by having it managed by the police. The idea was that controlling prostitution would prevent the unchecked spread of syphilis. There was also a belief at the time that banning prostitution altogether was not a realistic solution, focusing more on practical reality than religious doctrine. According to Christianity, sexual activity outside of marriage was considered sinful, but male desire for women outside of marriage was not something that could easily be suppressed. Facing this reality, the belief emerged that while prostitution was a sin, according to religious teachings, prohibiting it entirely would be impractical. It was thought that for the sake of eradicating syphilis, a more reasonable approach was needed. Thus, in 1802, a system of government-managed prostitution was established. Under this system, brothels where prostitutes were certified to be free of venereal diseases were set up by the government. These were the Maison Closes introduced at the beginning. The prostitutes working in these brothels were regularly examined, 2 or 3 times a month, by doctors dispatched by the police to prove they were free from disease. Since modern blood tests hadn't been developed yet, doctors would visually inspect the prostitutes' genitals for any signs of disease. If a woman was diagnosed with an illness, she was immediately forced into hospitalization. However, the treatment provided in these hospitals was, by modern standards, appalling. At the time, the prevailing treatment for syphilis was based on the belief that expelling bad substances from the body would cure the disease. As a result, mercury, a toxic substance, was often used. People believed that because mercury was a liquid metal, it had healing properties, and it was frequently used as a treatment for various illnesses. In the case of syphilis, patients were made to drink mercury or inhale its fumes as part of the treatment. The belief was that the disease would leave the body, along with the patient's saliva. However, mercury is poisonous and causes severe side effects. Many patients likely found their health worsening as a result of this treatment. Furthermore, these treatments were not conducted in regular hospitals, but rather in medical prisons. Since mercury treatment could take months, patients were locked in prisons to prevent them from escaping mid-treatment. The environment in these medical prisons was harsh, and those confined there were treated like criminals. Being diagnosed with syphilis was essentially treated as a crime, resulting in punishment. Despite the government's efforts to certify prostitutes as safe and healthy, The measures were far from perfect. Diagnosis at the time was primarily visual, based on whether symptoms were visible. Even if a woman still carried syphilis, she could be declared cured if her symptoms temporarily subsided, allowing her to return to work. The fight against syphilis at the time was full of flaws, but the French government tried its best to contain the disease by establishing these closed brothels, the Maison Closes, and several Maison Closes were built. The women working there lived and worked entirely within the brothel, spending their days confined to these spaces. The buildings themselves had to remain out of sight from the general public, so the exteriors were closed off and unremarkable. Many of the Maison Closes were surrounded by high walls, and the windows were fitted with frosted glass or iron bars, so that people walking by could not see inside. There were no windows where prostitutes could be seen, luring customers, and signs advertising the establishment were banned. Instead, these brothels were referred to by their street address. The only clue for potential customers was the red light, illuminating the address number of the building. Many Parisian buildings had courtyards, and the high-end brothels had especially large ones that could accommodate carriages. Once customers entered the courtyard, the gate would be closed behind them. The ability to discreetly enter a brothel without being seen became a marker of a high-class establishment. However, eventually, a different type of Maison Close emerged, the Sphinx, a brothel that opened in 1931, operated under the guise of a bar. The first floor served as a bar, while the second and third floors were where the prostitutes worked. Unlike the closed, secretive Maison Closes that had been the norm, the Sphinx had a more open design. Its name was based on the Sphinx of Egypt, and it became famous for its signage featuring the profile of a pharaoh. Even though brothels were not allowed to display signs, this was permitted because it was technically a bar sign. What was the interior of these Maison Closes like? Let's step further inside and explore the interior of the Maison Close. The more exclusive Maison Closes were designed to ensure that clients wouldn't encounter each other. Various efforts were made to create a sense of extraordinary experience, with elaborate decor and furnishings to match. As soon as a client entered through the grand double doors, they would feel a sense of exclusivity. Inside, opulent interiors awaited, and the clients were guided through. Finally, they would reach a room where several women were waiting, and the clients could select a prostitute by seeing them in person. The interior design of these brothels changed over time, reflecting different styles. In the early 19th century, Rococo-style interiors were particularly popular, characterized by feminine, elegant curves and delicate ornamentation. Rococo, a style that became fashionable during the reign of Louis XV in the 18th century, was fitting for the image of the Maison Close, as Louis XV was known for leading a luxurious life filled with numerous mistresses. By the late 19th century, however, exotic styles from around the world had gained popularity, thanks to events like the 1878 Paris Exposition. This influence led to brothels incorporating exotic themes into their rooms. One famous brothel, Chabanais, created rooms themed after foreign lands, such as the Egyptian room, the Chinese room, offering clients a sense of world travel. Chabanais even had rooms themed after historical figures known for their debauchery, such as the Napoleon III room and the Louis XV room, allowing clients to indulge in fantasies of historical figures notorious for their womanizing. The decorations and furnishings in these rooms were often extraordinarily expensive. Some beds in these brothels were considered works of art, costing over $460,000 each in modern value. The luxury of the Maison Closes was often seen as a competition among the brothels, with each trying to outdo the others in terms of opulence. By the time World War I ended in 1919, Art Deco, the cutting-edge style of the time, was incorporated into the brothel's interiors. A brothel known as 122 was famous for these kinds of immersive experiences, even having a restaurant on site that could be used by patrons not engaging in sexual services. However, This restaurant had one major distinction: the waitresses wore nothing but aprons. Such details seem almost fantastical today, but they were part of the historical reality of these establishments. The Sphinx brothel, which we mentioned earlier, also had a bar and acted as a gathering place for the wealthy elite. In this way, high-end Maison Closes adapted over time to meet changing tastes, offering elaborate designs and out-of-the-ordinary experiences to delight their clientele. However, not all Maison Closes in Paris were as luxurious as those we've discussed so far. There were also establishments aimed at clients with less money. Naturally, the level of service and the ambience varied according to the price range. Well-known establishments became so famous that their names, such as Chabanais, 122, and Sphinx, became synonymous with the word brothel itself. Today's value ranged from about $135 to $145 for 30 minutes, while in lower-tier Maison Closes, the fees ranged from around $67 to $100. The prostitutes working in lower-tier establishments had to serve dozens of clients per day. Thus, even though the term Maison Close refers to brothels in general, the services and prices varied greatly depending on the rank of the establishment. The prostitutes' earnings were not fixed salaries but were based on a commission system. The more clients they served, the more they earned. However, the amount the prostitutes received was 50% of the sales. Additionally, since many of the women lived on site at the brothels, their living expenses, including food and clothing, were also deducted from their earnings. The cost of living in these establishments was exorbitant. As a result, many prostitutes found themselves with little money left after deductions, despite the general perception that prostitution was a high-paying job. So why did women choose to work in these Maison Closes? The most common reason for becoming a prostitute was poverty and a poor family environment. Contrary to the popular image of sexually promiscuous women who became prostitutes out of personal desire, this was found to be a minority, fueled a desire for luxury as a means to draw attention. In short, their pursuit of love was the underlying motivation. What did their daily lives look like inside these closed establishments? Next, let's take a closer look at their daily routine. The daily life of the prostitutes. The daily routine of the women working in the Maison Closes was highly regimented. Their day began around 11 a.m. with the sound of jangling keys, as the madam of the house would walk through the corridors to wake them up. The women, still in their nightwear, would gather in the dining room to have brunch, often discussing the previous day's earnings and clients. After brunch, they had a few hours of free time. At around 4 p.m., it was time for them to start preparing for the evening. They would first stand naked in front of mirrors to inspect their bodies for any signs of disease or injury. In brothels that had bathing facilities, the women would take turns bathing. Hairdressers would arrive to style their hair, and they would select their outfits for the night, ensuring they looked their best. By 6 p.m., the red light above the house number, which acted as the brothel sign, would be lit, signaling that the Maison Close was open for business. At this time, the women would sit down for dinner, which was often one of the highlights of their day. Given the importance of keeping the women in good health for business, these meals were often quite elaborate. After dinner, the women would change into their chosen outfits, and the night's work would begin. The last client would typically leave around 3 a.m. and after the clients were gone, the women would clean up, tally their earnings, and finally head to bed around 4 or 5 a.m. Unlike the luxurious beds they used during their work hours, their own beds were simple, uncomfortable, and often located in cramped attic spaces. Although they spent most of their time confined to the Maison Close, these women were not without their legal rights. French law granted them the right to leave the premises whenever they wished or to go on vacation. In practice, even women living and working full-time at a Maison Close were allowed to leave for a few days about once every 2 weeks. These rare days off were highly cherished, as they allowed the women to go out with lovers, attend dance halls, or simply enjoy a break from the monotony of their lives. However, These outings were risky for the brothel owners. Many of the women were heavily in debt to the brothels, and there was always a fear that they might not return after a night out, choosing instead to escape the life of confinement. This debt system was, in fact, a deliberate way to keep the women tied to the brothel. When women began working at a Maison Close, they usually had to borrow money from the brothel to cover their travel expenses from their hometowns or to settle in the city. Although they earned money by taking clients, the brothel would deduct living expenses, food, and clothing costs from their earnings, leaving them perpetually in debt. In some cases, the more exploitative brothels would deliberately inflate these expenses, ensuring that the debt continued to grow rather than shrink. In addition to this complex situation, there was a figure akin to a lover, who often manipulated the women emotionally and financially. These relationships were typically toxic, with the women working tirelessly to earn money to give to their pimps, often at the expense of their own financial stability. Thus, the women working in the Maison Closes were physically confined to the buildings, but they were also emotionally trapped, driven by their need for money and love. However, over time, the public began to criticize the system. Novels and articles exposing the financial exploitation and harsh conditions of these brothels became more widespread, increasing public scrutiny. At first, the police were on the side of the brothel owners, enforcing the rules and regulations that kept the women under control. But gradually, even the police started to sympathize with the women's plight. At the same time, new types of establishments began to emerge, offering different kinds of experiences. Instead of focusing purely on sexual services, these new places emphasized romantic and emotional engagement, allowing clients to enjoy the illusion of a romantic relationship rather than a purely transactional one. As these establishments became more popular, more women chose to work there, leaving the traditional Maison Closes behind. Facing mounting public criticism, a shift in societal attitudes, and competition from new establishments, the Maison Closes became increasingly difficult to operate. In 1946, France officially passed a law abolishing legalized prostitution, leading to the closure of all Maison Closes. The use of penicillin to successfully treat syphilis in 1943 further rendered the brothel system unnecessary. Many former Maison Close buildings still stand in Paris today, with some having been converted into luxury hotels. While you can no longer experience the mysterious world of the Maison Closes, those interested in history can still stay at one of these locations and perhaps catch a glimpse of the past. The history of the world is still full of mysteries. Let's continue exploring these mysteries together. Thank you for watching, and see you on our next journey.